What makes a fight good? Is it the scale, the strategy, the emotional weight, or is it just having to play a numbers game? Yeah, I have a feeling that's not that last one. According to its definition, a fight is a violent confrontation or struggle, usually involving the exchange of physical blows or the use of weapons. Simple enough, but if that were all that mattered, why is it that some fights feel gripping and intense, while others feel more like power scaling slop? Well, nowadays, a fight isn't even limited to just fights and weapons. See Death Note for an example of mind battles just as brutal as those fought with swords. No, at its core, fighting in stories exists for just one reason: to achieve something through force. While some stories let conflicts play out through dialogue, drama, and tensions, others take a more simple approach and say, if I beat you, then I've won. Thus, fights become a powerful narrative device. They engage the audience, drive the plot, and can even be used to express the writer's message if executed well enough. This formula defines most battle manga, where characters overcome their obstacles through mostly strength and skill alone. But no matter how well a fight is choreographed, no matter how many perfectly cut cubes appear on screen, and no matter how many impact frames you add, there is one thing that will always kill its impact, and that is writing through power levels. Power levels didn't just appear out of nowhere. They stem from a natural human instinct, and that is the desire to quantify strength. From ancient myths of warriors with the strength of 1,000 men, to RPGs where numbers dictate a character's power, we've always tried to measure and rank strength in ways that feel concrete. In storytelling, especially those with battle-driven narratives, power levels serve a simple purpose. They give a clear sense of progression and scale. If character A has a power level of, say, 5,000, and character B has a power level of 1,000, the 5 carry the 1, Character A is obviously going to win. It's an easy and admittedly lazy way to establish power dominance, without the need for deep storytelling or complex character dynamics. Of course, the explosion of power levels as a trope can largely be traced back to one franchise, Dragon Ball Z. The moment Dragon Ball Z introduced the famous "It's over 9,000!" power levels became ingrained in anime culture. The Scouter, a device used by Frieza's forces to measure power levels, gave characters and audiences a tangible way to understand strength differences. Now, unfortunately, what a lot of people didn't realize was the fact that Dragon Ball, in of itself, was critiquing the idea of using power levels. Time and time again, the Scouters would actively fail to accurately measure the strength of a character, as the fighters' power levels fluctuated wildly and hardly gave an accurate reading on their strength. The entire point was that relying on something as static as power levels to dictate strength in the first place was ridiculous. So much more goes into a fight than just numbers and stats. Unfortunately though, quite a lot of writers and a massive portion of the anime community didn't quite get that memo. We do love the power scaling community, don't we? Thus, the idea stuck. Other anime and manga latched onto the concept of numerical strength ranking, often as a lazy way to justify victories or build tension. Instead of making fights engaging through strategy, tension, or character development, power levels turned them into grade 3 equations. Whoever has the bigger number wins. The problem is that this approach strips fights of all suspense, creativity, and even sometimes narrative weight. And in some of the worst cases, this actively makes the story worse. The 7 Deadly Sins kind of sucks, but it wasn't always this way. When the series first debuted, the fights were honestly some of the best I'd seen in shonen. They had a strong mixture of tension, unpredictability, and of course, raw hype. Battles inevitably relied on some degree of raw power, yes, but more than that, there was also a heavy reliance on the characters' unique abilities and some admittedly clever strategies, forcing characters to overcome opponents through actually creative applications of their skills. One scene that will forever live rent-free inside of my head Aside from literally everything Escanor did across the entire show, man, he carried that series. Is the moment where Gil Thunder throws his spear from countless miles away, and Meliodas barely manages to catch it before turning it back around and throwing it right back at him. From this small interaction alone, the levels of strength both characters are capable of are given to the audience without the need for a single line of dialogue or defined strength number on the screen. And yet, despite the author clearly knowing how to establish a character's strength without the need for power levels, I don't know, maybe he just stopped caring. I still don't know what was worse for the series, this or making every single character like 9-year-olds. Midway through the series, the 7 Deadly Sins introduced a numerical ranking system for every character's strength using a device called Balor's Eye to assign a specific number to each fighter, immediately draining all fights of their tension when used. Let me ask you a simple question. Even if you don't write, how would you introduce an intimidating antagonist? Would you show them performing some insane feat of strength? Or perhaps an instance of overwhelming cruelty? Or maybe you could slap a big fat arbitrary number over their head and call it a day. The series used to do the former, but by the time the 10 Commandments arrived, well, rather than showcasing boosts in power through at the very least a slightly bigger explosion when attacking or something, it would be, wow, their power level is so much higher, or no way, they had a secret second form and now their power level has increased again. Boring. But even beyond this, the most annoying use of power levels has to be when it's used to show a character's progress. Imagine for a second you have a friend who loves to play football, or soccer for my majority American viewers. He goes off to some academy for like 5 years, and when he finally comes back, you're wondering how exactly he's grown better. Has he learned more about positioning and tactics? Has he developed some skill moves? Or at the very least, has he learned how to shoot the ball differently? Nope, his shoot strength is now slightly higher, and that's about it. That's pretty much how it feels when this method is used to show a character's progress. Like Meliodas went off to unlock his true forbidden power, and when he finally succeeded, the only noticeable difference was his invisible number going up. This approach not only massively simplifies the possible complexity you could have gained through your character's training, it also forces this extremely linear progression of power, which just stunts your world and removes all interest from the fights. I really hate it when a character goes off to train and the only tangible difference is that they can destroy bigger things. If the 7 Deadly Sins had stuck to its earlier method of showcasing strength through feats, abilities, and creative combat, its fights could have remained engaging throughout the series. Instead, the introduction of power levels flattened the narrative stakes and made battles more of a numbers game. This is the perfect example of why power levels are one of the worst ways to write fights. Rather than enhancing storytelling, they reduce it to a predictable, formulaic mess, where victory is determined before the fight even begins. Unless you pull out a bullshit random transformation, as most writers tend to do. But at that point, why even have power levels in the first place? Luckily, the sequel to the series at least seems to have corrected this mistake. But I'm not gonna read that for other obvious reasons. Enjoying the video so far? Well, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It's completely free, but would help me out a great deal. Last time, only 1.3% of you guys were subscribed, but to be fair, we have managed to double that, so thank you. Anyway, consider subscribing and let's get back to the video. So if power levels are the worst way to write fights, then how should you do it? Well, let me introduce you to a little series called In Jojo's Bizarre Adventure, every single fight is a puzzle between the main cast and the relevant antagonist. Araki doesn't rely on raw strength or numbers to determine the outcome of his battles, instead allowing the strategy and creativity of each new encounter to speak for itself. Unlike traditional battle manga where the strongest fighter is granted the win, JoJo fights operate under a different set of rules. The primary one being that every single ability has its limits. No character is outright invincible. Even the most powerful abilities have clear strengths, weaknesses, and drawbacks. A seemingly weak stand can defeat a stronger one if cleverly applied. Next, tension doesn't come from a difference in strength or feats. It comes primarily from the unknown. In other shonens, you're meant to be afraid of the current antagonist because he can blow a mountain up or something. In JoJo, you're afraid of the current antagonist because a Glock just popped out of a folded piece of paper and your balls are about to explode. In most fights, the enemy's ability isn't immediately obvious. Usually, it's based on some weird fun fact that Araki probably picked up in a science journal before applying it as an antagonist's ability. Thus, JoJo's protagonists must analyze, adapt, and counter their opponent's abilities mid-battle, forcing a conflict of both brute force and of the mind. Another reason to love the fights in JoJo is how the cast's abilities evolve. Your stand's limitations never really increase. If anything, there are more cases of stand abilities getting worse with time. Instead, protagonists must find and discover new ways to use their abilities based on what they are already capable of. Josuke learning to track people down using his healing ability, Joner realizing he can heal people by turning the objects inside of them into flesh. Pretty much everything Jolene does with Stone Free. These are all examples of characters becoming more versatile and useful in fights without directly gaining a direct power-up to their abilities. Overall, this kind of unpredictable dynamic is what makes fights so engaging. When the audience doesn't know how a fight will immediately end, they are invested. Both sides, both the villains and the heroes, have the chance to turn the tables at any moment through creative and unexpected uses of their abilities. Contrast this with power level based fights where the strongest character always wins, and it's easy to see why fights like JoJo are so much more compelling. By focusing on tactics, unpredictability, and tension, Araki ensures that every battle is engaging and memorable, without ever needing a single instance of power levels to dictate the outcome. You may have noticed a tiny little lie in my last point. JoJo's isn't entirely stat-free. Araki has implemented a system called stand stats that orchestrates what each individual stand is capable of. This is what I consider a middle ground between power levels and complete freeform scaling, which I call power rankings, and almost every single modern shonen anime uses them. Unlike power levels, which are a specific numeric indication of strength, power rankings are more or less categories. These are your sorcerer grades in Jujutsu Kaisen, your shinobi organization system in Naruto, and your Gote 13 ranks in Bleach. Basically, they are categories of fighters where the higher you go, the stronger a character is expected to be. You have more specialized cases like JoJo's, where specific physical metrics are measured, and you have more broad cases where fighters are just generally expected to be better at everything across the board the higher in rank you go. There are many benefits to this system, as it strikes a middle ground where it gains all the benefits of power levels without removing as much of the tension. For starters, the audience can immediately understand what bracket of power a character is from their ranking alone, which can be used to effectively build hype for specific characters while not spoiling exactly how powerful they are like power levels would. While it still is obvious that one person in a higher rank should beat someone from a lower one, for those within the same rank, the audience can be led to believe that the fight could go either way. Another great advantage to this system is that it immediately places an upper ceiling to the verse. Verses without upper ceilings face the issue of infinite escalation, where characters can almost endlessly continue to grow in strength without needing to really apply any new knowledge or complex strategies to do so. For most of Dragon Ball's runtime, Goku could do like 10,000 more push-ups and suddenly be twice as strong as he was last week without really needing to do anything special. Meanwhile, in series like Jujutsu Kaisen, special grades were immediately introduced from the get-go to represent the cap of the verse, and across the entire series, that ceiling is never really replaced. This system allows authors to engage in power scaling without having to use hard metrics. You gain all the hype of someone with a bigger number, or in this case ranking, suddenly appearing into the plot, without essentially spoiling the outcome of all their fights. At their core, fights in storytelling should be engaging, dynamic, and meaningful. Whether it's an intense battle of strength, a clash of ideals, or a strategic mind game, a well-written fight keeps the audience invested because the outcome isn't predetermined by a simple number. Power levels strip fights of all of this by reducing them to a mere comparison of numbers. As we saw with the 7 Deadly Sins, this approach makes battles more predictable and removes that excitement that makes the story fun. I'd much rather see an antagonist do some insane feats to display their strength than I would a number popping up above their head. On the other hand, series like Jojo's Bizarre Adventure prove that strategy, intelligence, and adaptability make for far better fights than sheer power ever could. When characters must use their wits instead of just overpowering their opponents, every battle becomes a puzzle that both the protagonist and the audience can solve. Because at the end of the day, even if the power scaling community might say otherwise, the best fights aren't about who's stronger. They're about who's smarter, craftier, and more determined. When a fight is driven by narrative stakes, clever tactics, and character depth, it becomes memorable. But when things are driven by hard numbers, it becomes so much more forgettable. That's why power levels aren't just a bad way to write fights. They're the absolute worst. Thank you for watching the video. Feel free to drop your favorite power ranking system in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like and subscribe. And anyway, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.